Green tech in general, and just to establish my bona fides here, I've got a solar system on my house. I believe in the climate change data. I'm not a skeptic on that. I'm a skeptic on the technologies that we seem to have all latched onto to fix it. So whether you're looking at wind or solar, whether you're looking at EVs or e-trucks, the materials that you need, you're talking in excess of an order of magnitude more in order to build the stuff compared to conventional tech. So for example, your conventional car has about 2 pounds of copper and maybe 5 or 6 pounds of nickel. Your average electric car needs, 130 of each. It needs all kinds of materials that we don't normally put into vehicles, and they have a global supply chain and global sourcing, most of which are in very uncomfortable places. So, 60% of the cobalt comes from one place, and the second biggest source just went offline in Russia. So while we can't have inexpensive oil without the Russians, we absolutely cannot have the green transition without the Russians. And that plays for almost every piece of everything. In the Western Hemisphere, to a degree, this is less true because a lot of those raw materials are sourced here or maybe in Australia. I expect that to still work. But if you're in Eurasia or Africa, no, absolutely not. Having a house with solar and a battery system, that might work for about a tenth, maybe a tenth of the U.S. population. We're the first world country with the best solar profile. But if you're not in a kind of a belt from central Texas to Los Angeles, roughly, you're not going to have enough solar intensity to be able to power a house. Also remember that if you've got a 6 kilowatt solar system, which is about as big as you can put on most houses, it's going to take 3 days to charge your Tesla, assuming you're not using the power for anything else. I think these are all interesting technologies. I just don't think we're there yet. I think that nuclear is going to be a bigger part of the future than a lot of people think because, believe it or not, its supply chain is simpler. Even with non-proliferation concerns, it's simpler than it is for solar panels. With today's technology, we're talking Australia, the United States, Mexico, Britain, Denmark, assuming they can get their head out of their asses, Argentina, and Chile. Those are the only countries in the world that have a good enough green tech, solar, and wind profile to theoretically get more than half of their electricity from a really robust build out, I'm not counting the cheating that places like Denmark are currently doing, where they have a lot of wind towers, but they still source the majority of their power from the European grid. I'm talking about if you're doing a standalone national system. Those are the only ones. It doesn't mean that it can't help at the margins for other places, but our energy intensity and the energy density problems of solar and wind just haven't been surmounted yet in other locations where it's less favorable.
Net zero with today's technology until we have figured out a low-cost mass storage electricity system. And that means storing electricity not for 4 hours, but for 4 months so you can make it through the winter. Until we have that technology, net zero is really dumb from an environmental point of view. Forget from an economic point of view. It's suicidal from an economic point of view. But from an environmental point of view, there isn't enough lithium on the planet to make that work. Now, in the UK, you do have advantages over almost everyone else in your hemisphere because the UK has some of the best wind resources of the world. And if you put a wind turbine high enough, you can tap stronger currents that are more reliable that can actually generate base load. We're seeing that in the North Sea. In the United States, we're seeing that in Texas, and we're seeing that in Iowa. It's not foolproof, but wow, is it better than what we had 5 or 10 years ago. So I don't mean to suggest you can't green your system. I'm just saying that getting to zero today is not possible. And if you try, and if you do it by decommissioning more reliable energy producing systems, which almost by default means nuclear or fossil fuel, you are going to have high prices and rolling brown and blackouts. We are seeing that across Central Europe right now. The technology just isn't there. So it's real. That doesn't mean you should give up. People have bought the ideology, unfortunately, without looking under the hood. We're just not there yet. And Europe is now giving us an excellent example of 40 years of policy of what exactly not to do. Net zero in its current form with today's technology is economically and ecologically suicidal. We've got the Ukraine war then. The Russians have recently shut off Nord Stream, and we know that all the pipelines that are crossing Ukraine to Europe are going to get blown up one way or another this calendar year. So you can count on roughly 4 to 6 million barrels a day of crude and roughly 9 to 12 BCF. So what's that? 90 to 120 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year going offline before the end of the year. And that will obviously sucker punch everyone in Europe repeatedly. Again, UK has a little different system. You're further from the Russians. You hardly use any of their stuff. You have the option of taking stuff from the North Sea first. You have closer access to LNG from the United States. So you're going to be able to watch Europe. And when you're not giggling, because that would be rude, you're hopefully going to learn a few things on what not to do as you're adjusting your own energy plans. But all of that is going to be inflationary no matter who you are. We're losing potash fertilizer that used to come from Russia and Belarus. We're losing phosphate fertilizer, which used to come from China. And we are losing nitrogen fertilizer, which is made from natural gas globally. So we know food prices have to go up. Again, I don't see the UK starving, but that contributes to inflation. But what's really going on, in my opinion, is a labor story. In the UK, in the US, our largest generation has been our baby boomers. They're all retiring right now. And the kids who are 0 to 20 who are now moving into the workforce, they are the smallest generation that either of our countries has ever seen. In the United States, that is already an annual shortage of 400,000 workers. In my country, that's going to go up for the next 12 years until we hit 900,000. So we are looking at labor inflation here being higher than inflation